All right, our next speaker in our beef room is Dr. Bailey. Dr. Bailey's official title is State Extension Beef Specialist for the University of Missouri. He's going to talk about building resilience in your beef cattle operation through diversified grazing. So, and probably whatever else you want to talk about beef cattle.
I was going to say we can.
From what I've seen from a Dr. Bailey presentation, what do you want to talk about?
That's how I was going to say good morning to everybody.
So welcome.
I appreciate y'all being here this morning. So today's talk is going to be a talk more about strategy and tactics. And I know that sounds maybe a little bit esoteric on the front end, but I let Google AI tell me what the difference between strategy and tactics was this morning. Let me pull it up here real quick, because I wanted everybody to start off with a good definition. So strategy is the overall plan, while tactics are the specific actions taken to execute that plan. So, right, if we implement a managed grazing system on a farm, and then we get to deciding whether we want to mob graze at a significantly high stock density or whether we want to rotate cattle once a week at a lower stock density, that's an example of tactics, right? Strategy, and what I want to talk about today is how are we allocating the resources that we have at our disposal to our business, right? Because livestock production should and is a business. And I think that that's where we have lost the forest for the trees over the years, in that we've gotten so wound up in how we're going to do things, and we haven't stepped back and asked a question about why we're doing the things we're doing. And is there a way that we can do these better? And you know, I've been working on stocker cattle research with fescue over the past few years, and it's really sort of opened my eyes to thinking more about the bigger picture, the whole system, and how we allocate resources on our farm. Now, I'll tell you that today is going to be a very cookie cutter presentation that has a generic farm in mind, and so what you hear today, I hope more so than the words that I say, is that you understand the thought process that I went through to get to where I'm going, and so that you can take it then home and apply it to your own operation as well, because your resources are going to be different than my resources, are going to be different than the person next to you's resources. And so, you know, resilience, I want to talk about resilience because I don't think that we build our livestock enterprises with resilience in mind, and I certainly, we have had our resilience tested over the last few years, right, with things like drought, black swan events in the market that's made, you know, fat cattle prices drop like $20 a hundredweight seemingly overnight. Now it's rebounded quickly, right? The fat cattle market's strong, feeder market's as strong as it's ever been, but you know, a black swan event is supposed to be a once in a generation deal, but boy, I've seen about 3 black swans since the last pandemic. So, you know, I think more about them today than I did before. Now, a lot of my worldview is shaped by a quote that I heard a long time ago by an old rancher back in New Mexico where I grew up. You know, he said that the most profitable operations are not the operations that make the most money in the good years. When you're dealing with livestock, when you're dealing with Mother Nature, when you're dealing with land, when you're dealing with forages, he said that the most profitable beef operations lose the least money in the bad years. And so, you know, from this perspective, a lot of what I want to talk about today comes from a frame of reference of drought, because we've gone through multiple years of drought, and quite honestly, our rainfall patterns have just become very boom or bust in the last few years. Now, I'm not here to open up some discussion about climate change or government control of weather or any sort of conspiracy theories like that. I left my tinfoil hat at home, so we're not going to talk about any of that stuff. But I certainly see the situation play out over and over and over again, where a cow-calf producer in Missouri assumes that with a 40% or 40-inch annual precipitation rate per year on a normal year, that we're going to have aggressive stocking rates for our cow herd, and then when we get during periods of drought, they're going to come up, we're going to be reactive to them rather than proactive, meaning that we're going to respond after they've started, after you've run out of grass, rather than proactively planning for them. And then we're gonna be faced with one of two really unpalatable options, right? Selling cows into a down market. I know my articles about culling cows during times of drought have honestly really not been all that well received by some of the angry phone calls that I've gotten over the years. Now they could be just the screaming local minority, but I mean, I can appreciate their perspective, right? If everybody else is hauling their cows to town, why would you want to sell low and buy high later on? That sounds like a business plan that's not going to be very durable or very long lasting. So I can appreciate where a farmer would not want to sell cows in a down market, but at the same time, I've seen now twice in the 7 years that I've been in Missouri where the price of a bale of hay will double or triple seemingly overnight. Certainly within less than a month's time, right? So I remember in 2018 very vividly, the 1st of June, a bale of hay was $30 a bale. Unfortunately, I think we might have put up about 30 bales of hay across the entire state of Missouri in May of 2018. So, seemingly overnight, a bale of hay was $90. Same thing has happened in spring of 23. And, we've seen this happen again. And I balanced some rations for farmers last year. No lie, they spent over $6 a cow a day in hay. Okay? How do you pencil that? And even if you have to feed $6 in hay to cows per day for 30 days, that's $180, right? So let me kind of let you in my mind a little bit. The average calf gains about 2 pounds of weight per day between birth and weaning. Okay? And so if that pound of weight is worth, let's say $3, because I'm going to be generic and assume that we're not thinking about price slides, and I'm kind of combining the steer and heifer price right now. If I spend $6 a day in hay for the cow, and my calf gains 2 pounds of weight a day that's valued at $3 a pound, that's revenue neutral right there, right? And because some of these rations that I built were based around fescue hay that I wouldn't feed to goats, much less to cattle, I had to put 50 cents per head per day of supplement on top of that just to try and meet their energy requirements, particularly for a fall calving cow. And so my thought process then went to culling, early weaning, some of those things, not so much because I was trying to maintain profitability, but quite honestly, I was trying to minimize losses at that point. Now, that can be a tough sell for farmers, and it's a rather ruthless decision process to have to go through, and one that you don't want to have to go through, but it's still kind of a reality, unfortunately. And I've looked over the years at historical precipitation records across the state of Missouri not because I'm a meteorological nerd or anything like that, but it's interesting. There seems to be about 2 severe droughts that are widespread across the state every decade in Missouri, and that's going back in the records over 90 years. If 2 years out of 10 we're faced with not making any money, should we not then plan for that and have a strategy in place where we can minimize those losses in those bad years? That's what I'm gonna share with you all today. Now, this problem is exacerbated by the fact that our growing season for our primary forage, which is tall fescue, is less than 240 days per year, yet beef cows require feed for 365 days, right? That's the fundamental weakness of the cow business. Now, I promise y'all I don't hate cows. It may seem like that. I'm sure the perception exists among some folks that have heard me speak multiple times that I hate beef cows. I do not. I grew up on a substantial cow-calf operation. I like cows, but cows, they are what I regard as a brittle business. The reason that I regard them as a brittle business, we don't make feed for them. We have to stockpile. We have to plan for shortages because whether it's Christmas or Thanksgiving, they gotta eat. Whether we've got sunshine and 70 degrees or it's cloudy and 10 degrees outside, they gotta eat, right? And couple that with the fact that at least in this part of the world, it's kind of fascinating to me. The majority of farmers, if you polled them and asked them what their stocking rate for cows on tall fescue is today, they would say that it's about 3, maybe 4 acres a cow. But if you look at the math, On forage production in terms of tons per acre, you look at forage utilization rates by beef cattle. In reality, that stocking rate that everybody has anchored to in their minds really only supports grazing for 8 to 9 months per year, which is much different than how it's done on west of the 100th parallel, where the 100th meridian, where you get into more arid rangeland environments, and stocking rates, quite honestly, are account for grazing 365 days a year. And a lot of this talk was shaped by the way that we ran the ranch that I was raised on. And so in eastern New Mexico, the average pasture is composed of blue grama, tubosa, side oats grama, buffalo grass. In all, these forages will produce about 750 pounds of feed per acre per year, right? So that's 90% less than what some Missouri pastures are capable of doing. This is the most productive forage system I've ever seen. I've been in New Mexico, Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Missouri. This is the most productive forage system I've ever seen. Yet, I feel like we've gone too far almost in setting our stocking rates where they're not sustainable, where we have to, supplement, we have to feed hay, we have to do things like that. Yet I regard those practices as foolish because the cost of haying is 2 to 3 times the cost of grazing, right? And so, plus you open yourself up for drought risk. But even further back from that, I think the bigger problem is, and this is a key takeaway from this whole presentation, I think the problem is that we are using all of our carrying capacity towards a single enterprise, and that single enterprise is cow-calf production. A lot of folks hang their hats on the fact that Missouri is the #3 state in the country in terms of beef cow inventory, right? And it's usually a tight race between Missouri and Oklahoma, #2 and #3. And so I think what we need to do, not just, and I'm not even at the macro level, but even at the micro or the individual farm level, I think we need to change how forage is allocated across enterprises to address this problem. Right, and so essentially then what I'm advocating for, and colleagues of mine like Wesley Tucker also will write articles about this occasionally, where we diversify your enterprises, and rather than having all of your eggs in one basket, look at maybe an operation having fewer cows and having alternative enterprises that are focused around animals that can be brought onto or taken off of the farm relatively quickly as a means of basically trying to plan for times when feed is short, 1. 2, also create conditions where perhaps you can extend the grazing season further into the winter so that you cut down on the number of days that you're feeding hay, perhaps so that you cut down on all the dadgum depreciable assets that you have to buy just to support your addiction to hay, right? So I guest lecture every year in our senior level beef production class at the University of Missouri, and I know that it makes my colleagues cringe when I do this, but I do it because they give me the platform, just like any other social media person who gets up and screams loudly about something that seems a little bit off the wall. Take a 100-acre field and assume that it's square, assume that it's all open, and take a beginning farmer. There's no fence, there's no water on this field, and ask yourself, how much is it going to cost me to put a 5-strand barbed wire fence and dig a pond for that 100-acre field, compared to, I'm going to, because it doesn't have fence, because it doesn't have water, I'm going to designate that as hay ground. And I'm going to buy all the equipment that I need to harvest the hay, to bale it, to store it, and then to go back and feed it. And I come up with numbers that are crazy. And that's not even going and buying brand new, overpriced John Deere equipment. That's going to big iron auctions and looking for 5-year-old equipment that's gently used. I'm at like $200,000 in equipment to buy to harvest that field as hay, versus about $70,000 to put a fence and dig a pond around it. Now, ask yourself this question when you're doing it as well, because this is a financial question, and I'm definitely stepping on ag economist toes here. At the end of 5 years, how much is that equipment worth? it's worth less than the day you bought it, right? But if you put, what's the useful life of a 5-strand barbed wire fence in that pond? The useful life is much longer. And in fact, you could argue that it actually adds value to the land if you have purchased it as well. And so that's where, to me, I feel like we have completely missed the boat in substantially committing a cow-calf enterprise to depreciable assets. So, Jim Garish, who's here today, he said a long time ago in one of his books, the more sun, or the more oil and iron you put between the sun and a cow's mouth, the less profitable you're going to be. And I truly believe that. So, back to these multiple enterprises, we're going to kind of go into these a little deeper. Now, I have focused primarily on stockers and backgrounders because, one, that's an interest to me from a research perspective, but certainly, multi-species grazing is a viable option. Heifer development, maybe switching to a model where you retain more heifers than you normally do. You develop them, and then you create extra bred heifers and either sell some cows and run a smaller herd and a larger heifer development enterprise, or given the fact that we are, at 28 million beef cows in the United States, we're producing more beef today than we did with the same number of cows we had in 1961. Perhaps then, we sell those bred heifers and that bred heifer enterprise becomes a separate enterprise from the cow-calf enterprise. Or even, quite frankly, honestly, custom grazing cattle for somebody else, custom grazing cows for somebody else. If you have more stockpile than you need in the fall, perhaps you can save somebody else in some hay feeding in the winter by taking on their cattle for a period of time. Because certainly, if you look at custom grazing rates, it's generally going to be in the kind of $1.25, maybe $1.50 a head a day. It's what I'm seeing, at least for dry, pregnant, non-lactating cows. It might be different for bulk calving cows, certainly, but there's a win-win deal for you and for the producer, especially during a period of time where they might be feeding hay and that costs them $3 to $4 a cow a day. Now, it's all about strategy and not tactics. And what we're trying to do is develop an enterprise that's complementary to your cow-calf operation that will allow you to move animals off the farm quickly, to be proactive to periods of drought, and basically try to be 30 days ahead of everybody else. We want to identify these problems earlier. Drought is defined as less than 80% of average annual precipitation. But using that definition for drought misses out on a fair bit of our understanding. How much grass does 4 inches of rain on December 15th, how much good does that do for our farms? It really doesn't do much good for it, right? Rain that happens in April and May, to me, is more important than rain that happens just about any other time of the year. And I would also argue that rain that occurs in August, September, is also more important than rain that happens in November or December, right? And so there's rainfall timing matters as well. Now, I will not go so far as to quantify the relative difference in forage production, because quite honestly, I think that's an area that guys like me need to spend more time studying and evaluating so that we can make informed decisions in the future. But what we're seeing is less consistent, fewer rainfall events, but larger rainfall events. So even in the years where we have average precipitation, if that average precipitation occurs outside of the growing season, I suspect that we're going to grow less forage than what we would expect. And so by having these flexible grazing units, if you know that you're dry in April and May, you're probably not going to catch up in terms of growing forage in June and July. So maybe the flexible grazing units they get sold off of the farm quicker, so that you stockpile more acres. You've got more acres to stockpile to spread your cows across during the drought period. Or similarly, if you're dry in the fall and then you get some rain over the winter, but not much, you're still below average, maybe you bring fewer of these flexible grazing units onto the farm next spring just to try and basically batten down the hatches and preserve that spring forage growth, with the goal of trying to have to reduce the unfortunate event of selling cows in a depressed market and also reduce the dependence on stored forages. And I'm going to show that to you. I'm going to illustrate that to you in this chart right here. So this is actually a slide that comes from our Missouri grazing schools. And what it shows is we got the calendar across the bottom here, the x-axis, and then we've got forage yield of cool season grasses like tall fescue. The green line represents animal demand. That's forage demand for a spring calving cow, essentially. And so you'll see any time that we've got white space between the green line and the orange blob, that's a deficit in forage that we have to carry over from another part of the year, or that we have to purchase feed off farm to fill that gap. And historically what we've done is we've harvested this excess here in the spring, but first we've let it go to seed, we've let it reduce in quality below the nutrient requirements, certainly of a lactating cow, but even in some cases, the nutrient requirements of a pregnant, non-lactating, second gestation, trimester gestation female as well. And so we have historically spent a boatload of money on depreciable assets to harvest this forage and move it to here, move it to there, maybe even in some extreme examples, move it to here. And I want to challenge that paradigm. I want to challenge that mental model that rather than harvesting that forage after it's lost its nutritive value, we instead build complementary business models on top of our existing cow herd such that we reduce this animal demand down more in line with what this curve can support, and then we harvest this forage in a vegetative state with a complementary enterprise. Okay, and so that's what I'm going to show you here in this innovative strategies for grazing enterprises. This is the work that we've been doing in Mount Vernon for 5 years now. This represents I know I could have spent more slides describing what this experiment is, but essentially what we do is we take backgrounded calves, somewhere in the 400 to 490. We've done roughly, I think the lightest animals we ever put out were about 450, and the heaviest we've ever done are about 620. And we'll stock them on tall fescue pastures for either 84 or 168 days. That stocking rate that we chose for this specific farm in this specific experiment was 2.4 head per acre on the double stock for 84 days, or 1.4 head per acre for 168 days. So essentially twice the animals for half the time, a little less than twice the animals. And so you'll note here that during the first 84 days, there's no difference in average daily gain between the two treatments, okay? So they did well. They had more grass than they knew what to do with. Forage quality was high. After 84 days, we removed the double stock cattle from pasture and we actually shipped them, but we kept the season-long cattle for another 84 days. Look at what their performance was over the last 84 days. They gained 28 pounds of weight in 84 days, okay? We provide salt and mineral in these projects, but we provide no other feed. There's no supplement, right? And this is the reason that people like me have been going around for 40 years and saying that stocker cattle enterprises don't work on tall fescue. The reason that they go out and say that, though, is that they get in their mind that they want to sell an 8 weight in the fall. They want to buy a 4 or 5 weight in the spring. They want to sell an 8 weight in the fall, and because that's the only thing that the feedlots are going to want to buy. But yet, unfortunately, to make that mental model work, they get their hands slapped because they carry these cattle through the summer slump, through the lowest quality forage production period of the year on tall fescue. They get poor gains during the summer months, so July and August principally, and then they conclude that stocker cattle systems don't work in Missouri. But the reality is that because of the way that tall fescue grows, where we get this high peak, we get a lot of forage in a relatively short amount of time. If we create an enterprise that essentially allows you to harvest that forage when it's in a vegetative state at its peak nutrient quality, and we focus less on body weight gain per head and we focus more on body weight gain per acre instead, we can totally change the paradigm. So if you look at the last line on this table here, this is body weight gain, but expressed in pounds per acre rather than pounds per head. In the a season-long experiment, 255 pounds of weight gain per acre. With the double stock, the twice the animals for half the time, we got an additional 96 pounds of body weight gain per acre in half the time. So we have not stocked the fescue in the spring properly in a lot of these classical stocker studies that would say tall fescue and stocker cattle systems don't work. The reality is we've got to graze it hard, we've got to graze it for a relatively short period of time, and we got to get off of it. We've got to avoid the summer slump. Or, depending upon your resources, we come and we ask questions, what else can we fill that forage gap in the summer with, right? So Dr. Nauman, our state grazing specialist and forage agronomist, he plants sunhemp into fescue sod to try and have a warm season annual that would allow you to extend the grazing season. That's not the only warm season annual option that's available to plant into fescue sod. There's also native warm season grasses that are being promoted by, NRCS and other entities like that as well. And so diversifying the forage species, having a complementary warm season grass that has a difference in growing pattern and growth season, right? So, one of my hotter takes that I don't often give, but I think that clover and fescue is a bad idea. I do, which is probably going to shock a lot of people. Here's why. Because clover is a cool season annual. Clover has the exact same growing pattern as tall fescue. It doesn't do diddly for this curve right here because it grows in the exact same time and the exact same deal as tall fescue does. If we were serious about annual legumes in our pasture systems, we would be looking at warm season annuals to try and fill this gap right here, or looking at cover crop type deals, fall like oats, something like that, to extend the grazing season. I think that clover is foolish. I will say it. I will go that far, but only from the perspective that it doesn't do anything to extend the forage gap. Now, I know that a lot of the argument for clover over the years has been about diluting the tall fescue out of the diet, particularly for beef cow diets, to mitigate symptoms of tall fescue toxicosis. But the reality of tall fescue toxicosis, in my opinion, is that tall fescue toxicosis is a disease of management. It's not a disease of chemicals. Because when we create ripe, overly mature, reproductive stem and seed head fescue, and we force the cattle to eat it, we know that the ergot alkaloids, the toxins that cause fescue toxicosis, concentrate in seed heads and stems. And when that's all they have to eat in the summer, they don't have any choice but to get dosed in the summer months. And I'm gonna hold questions till the end if that's all right. I appreciate it though. So back to our initial conversation. So, I don't think you look at this and say, well, you can only do that for 84 days, and then what do you do the rest of the year? One, because there's complementary species that will allow you to extend the grazing season into the summer. Second, there's also that fall regrowth period during the fall years that we actually get regrowth, where you could either stockpile more acres for your cows, you could have another set of stockers that you would run on that fall regrowth, you could custom graze some cows for somebody else. You got a lot of options because you still have the fall if you just use a stocker system to harvest that excess forage that's grown in the spring. One of the reasons that I feel strongly about it, and this is a hill I will die on, is how many of y'all have taken the time to account for the body weight gain per acre from a cow-calf enterprise and compared that back to a stocker enterprise? Right? A 550-pound calf weaned from a cow grazed on a stocking rate of 3 acres per cow, 550 divided by 3 is 183.33 pounds of weight gain per acre per year. So, now, I'm not saying sell all the cows, because beef cows are the principal marketing vehicle for low quality forages across the world, right? If they don't harvest it, ain't nothing else going to harvest it and make use of it. Certainly you or I aren't going to be productive on a diet of fescue stems and seed heads. But I think that in the future, we should think about how do we make less low quality forage? And how do we harvest more vegetative forage to improve the environmental resilience of our farms, to improve the economic resilience of our farms, and to diversify our enterprises. Now, the thing that you couple on top of that 183 pounds of weight gain per acre per year in a cow-calf operation is that you then also have to feed 4,000 pound bales of hay, 225 pounds of grain supplement, 91 pounds of mineral per cow per year. Now, the mineral you can't avoid. The hay and the grain you could potentially avoid. And to me, it horrifies me. I will go so far as to say it horrifies me that we allocate 3 acres per cow to a farm, and when we're doing our cow-calf planning budget, that's roughly at an economic cost of $230 per cow per year. But then we come on top of that and we allocate another $345.61 per cow per year to stored forages, to feed mineral and stored forages. That's the reason that cow-calf, the traditional cow-calf business model is not profitable. Couple that with depreciation on the equipment that you purchased, and couple that with just the investment that it takes to get started, right? Because across much of North America, it's kind of interesting. It costs to buy enough land to run a cow per year, costs between $15,000 and $20,000 per cow. And if she generates $250 in profit per year, she'll pay that land off 4 or 5 pandemics from now, if we're lucky. So let's kind of start to just talk about the practical implementation and considerations of this. You know, one of the consequences of what I'm talking about is fewer cows. I will completely acknowledge that and be upfront about it. And I completely acknowledge that from the perspective of a lot of farmers, at first, when I say fewer cows, that equals less revenue. And less revenue that's not sellable, right? Both literally and figuratively. But we have to consider the fact that what we're doing is not working, right? The most dangerous words in the English language are because that's how we've always done it. That really is. And if the alternative enterprises generate more body weight gain per acre, then farm income should increase, right? The stocker deal I showed you was double the body weight gain per acre as the cow was. And so even if you cut your cow herd by 20-25% and incorporate a small stocker enterprise, it wouldn't surprise me to see in not that long of a top period of time, you see that farm revenue begins to increase, and maybe that stocker deal becomes a third of your enterprise, maybe half, right? And certainly, the stocker deal I view as one of the few viable ways for a beginning farmer or rancher to get into the deal. That's why I'm so passionate about it, because if you think about a situation where you custom graze stockers on leased land, think about the inputs that you need to get that business model started versus going out and buying cows, right? I mean, the government loan programs, their limits and how much they'll offer to beginning farmers and ranchers are almost laughable today, because you can't buy enough land or have enough capital to borrow money to buy cows enough to support a family, right? And so what we see then as young producers, and I'm 38 years old and I fully recognize that I'm in the young producer category, is that then if somebody really has the gumption to get into the cow business, what are they doing instead? They're running cows on the side in the evening, and about the time that they've built their operation up into something where they can tell their boss, Dr. Kallenbach, peace out, I'm done at the University of Missouri, I'm gonna go run cows. I'm 55 years old, I've got 2 full-time jobs, I got kids that are fixing to leave home, and I'm pretty wore out, right? There's a lot of folks in that situation where essentially they create 2 full-time jobs for themselves. And I want us to think about enterprises and business models that would allow us to actually be cash flow positive on day one, not continually investing our hard-earned off-farm income into an enterprise that, while I will admit, is asset rich, right? Land grows at 6% per year. Wesley Tucker just showed that in a really nice article that I think was in Drovers, if I remember right, here recently, right? That's a very safe and steady investment, but land is not a cash flowing investment, right? It's an equity play. You hope to cash out that equity at some point way down the road. And you don't feed your kids on equity. I don't feed my kids on equity. Now, some of the underappreciated benefits from the producer's perspective to diversifying your enterprise is having, and I've talked a lot about stockers because that's what I know best, but having an additional enterprise that allows you to move cattle or livestock, other species, on and off the farm quickly, is that you can make quick changes to your stocking rate when drought hits. If you only allocate 2/3 of your carrying capacity on your farm to a beef cow enterprise, and you use that spring flush rather than harvesting it as hay, you harvest it as vegetative material, and you get 350 pounds of body weight per acre in your stockers, your effective stocking rate the day that those calves leave the farm across the rest of the farm. So let's say you're at 3 acres of cow, and let's say that you are allocating 1/3 of your farm to stockers. The day that those stockers leave the farm, you've got another acre for every cow the rest of the year. Okay, so that's more acres to stockpile in the fall. If you don't bring another set of flexible grazing units on the farm in the fall, that's more forage that's been stockpiled that will extend your grazing season. That will reduce the number of days that you feed hay in the winter. And while I will not go so far as to say that will completely eliminate hay feeding in the winter, it's certainly going to take it down from 120 days, 90 days down to maybe 60 or 45. I'm not so much of a hay abolitionist that I don't think anybody should ever feed hay, right? So hay serves a valuable purpose. I think it's a great insurance policy during, blizzards, extreme snowfall events. It's a great insurance policy to have. Like for us in New Mexico, we had 650 cows. We keep a semi-load of hay around every year. We buy a semi-load of hay out of Colorado every year, so that if we had a wildfire and burned half of our pastures, we at least had something to feed the cows, right? So I view hay as an insurance policy, not a part of the business plan. And so, I think those benefits of this diversifying your enterprises are wildly underappreciated by the broader public. Now, there are some common concerns that I want to address in kind of a frequently asked questions format here, because I know that these questions are in y'all's minds. My cattle are superior genetic merit, and I have selected for 50 years for these genetics. I don't want to bring sale barn trash onto my farm because they're going to bring whatever diseases that Dr. Payne was just talking about in the previous session, and maybe 3 or 4 others that he didn't cover on my farm. So, how would I address that question? One, I'm not advocating for running the cattle commingling them and running them as a single herd. So, right, you can avoid fence line contact, you can avoid sharing waters, you can segregate the animals to a certain extent on a farm. That would be one way about going about it. 2 is you don't have to necessarily use stockers of unknown origin that would have come through a sale barn, right? If you have a neighbor that has cows that wants to background their calves before they market them, they would be all from single farm, known origin, similar environment, similar location. Perhaps you create those types of arrangements with neighbors to background a single lot of calves, where you would mitigate some of that disease risk and then still segregate them from your cow herd. So I think it's segregation and it's also selecting animals that maybe have a lower risk of disease incidence in the first place that will allow you to alleviate that concern. Now the second question is going to be the one that's a little bit more of a bitter pill to swallow, because right, so I know that there's 43,000 farms in the state of Missouri that have beef cattle on them, and the average herd size in Missouri, the average beef herd is 35 cows, right? So how do I, if I've only got a 35 head cow herd, how do I incorporate a diversified livestock enterprise, a secondary flexible grazing unit focused enterprise onto the farm? And I think that's a time where you've got to ask the question, right? If you've got 35 cows, you're probably not feeding a family. It's a hobby, right? Respectfully, I say that respectfully, of course, but do you need to have cows? Should you just go all in on flexible grazing units at that point and reduce the equipment, the requirements that you might have? I don't want to say become a part-time farmer, but in a sense become a part-time farmer and create an enterprise that is leaner and meaner, that's productive, but right? I don't see it making a lot of sense to go from 35 cows to 20 cows, and because you're only going to allocate maybe, let's see, cows, 30, 40 acres to a deal like this. I mean, you maybe could make that work if you did a smaller livestock enterprise, like a sheep and goat kind of deal. But I think the bigger point that I want to drive across is, on a smaller farm, you could probably make it work with a small ruminant enterprise. But I think the question at that point becomes, should you even have cows in the first place on a smaller farm? So, final thoughts to wrap up in terms of grazing management and allocating resources. If the answer to your question is hay, you're asking the wrong question. I will fight to the death on that statement. Graze whenever possible, because hay is 2 to 3 times the cost of grazing on a per pound basis. That's not factoring in depreciation or equipment and capital requirements to feed the hay industrial complex. Avoid selling cattle in a down market during times of drought, right? That's a big piece of this whole motivation to diversify your enterprise, because selling cows low to buy high later on, that's not a wise business strategy. But at the same time, don't bury your head in the sand and say, oh, well, if I just go and buy a load of hay, I'm going to get through the drought, it's going to rain next week, and, everything will be okay. We're going to be fine after that, because overpaying for feed is as insidious of a deal as selling the cows in a down market. Now, just again, so we can have this discussion in the question section afterwards, I'm thinking about this outline is for a generic farm that's forage focused only, right? I mean, your resources, the palette of resources that you're going to have to work with are going to be different than mine. They're going to be different than the ones that I had in mind when I was putting this presentation together. Up here in North Missouri, right? Corn residue. Nebraska and other states have lapped us in terms of utilizing corn corn stalks as a beef cow resource, right? But we will say, well, we tore the fences out, we don't have water, we don't want to haul water, right? We've got a lot of barriers, resistance to bringing that crop residue onto the farm, or maybe concerns over compaction of the fields. That should be a part of the resource inventory that you do as you're thinking. Again, we're talking up higher level. We're talking about strategy. We're not talking about tactics, right? This is not mob grazing versus rotational grazing. This is higher level. This is how I structure my business. And, that's crop residues are a sorely underutilized resource in Missouri. So, all right. Well, that's all I've got. I think we got a few minutes. I wanted to leave some time for questions, so I would be glad to open it up and have a discussion about this. So, yes, sir.
So you're showing a graph there that has, of course, the cool feeding grass, feed growth in the spring, and growth in the fall. What do you suggest for getting through the summer slump there as far as forage is perspective?
Well, I think there's a number of options. So I'm going to just repeat the question so that make sure everybody hears it. So the question was, I showed the cool season growth curve, and there's a dip in productivity during the summer months, presumably July and August. What recommendations would I make? Well, first, I'm not a forage agronomist, I'm a ruminant nutritionist. So I can tell you more about the nutritive value of the potential forage options, maybe not so much about how well they might work on a specific farm and a specific soil type, but some of the options that are available out there would be sun hemp, like I mentioned, that Dr. Nelman discusses. I mean, sorghum Sudan grass would be another option that's potentially an annual option. The other thing that I want to highlight is, devoting a portion of the farm to a native warm season perennial grass as well, so that you've got, exactly. Yeah, so that would be one. Those would be the big three, at least in terms of native warm season grasses, and then, you know, there are other options out there, the warm season annuals that would be potential. I mean, millet's another one, I think, if I remember correctly. Dr. Collenbach, do you have anything to add to that as a former forage agronomist who died and became an administrator?
He's done a great job. The pearl millet's the one I think.
Yeah.
There are other millets.
So,
So I think that's good. So actually, I had the same question of, okay, what you suggest for fall, I think I heard you say oats. Is maybe a late fall and early spring?
so oat.
As well, and wheat to do?
Yeah, so I would say the only reason I'd say oats is because at least Dr. Dowman tells me that they're a little more productive in the fall than maybe in the spring, or they're more productive in the fall than some of the other species. Like wheat, rye can be productive in the fall, but generally the majority of their forage growth is going to occur in the early spring, right? And so now the question then becomes, if you're grazing further into the fall because you changed your how you allocated your resources, then perhaps trying to fill the forage gap in November, December becomes a very uncommon deal, and so then you can afford to wait until the cool season annuals that you planted become productive in the late winter, early spring. So I think that's where it kind of depends, right? So I would say rye, cereal rye, wheat would be two very common ones that a lot of folks have tried over the years.
And then you said you're seeing the best like in addition to sun, what would you intercede in your investment?
Anything that's a warm season annual, honestly. You're asking the same question as the first question, but this time maybe focusing more on legumes. Sun hemp would be a warm season annual legume, at least, that we would have highlighted. But it's about breaking the functional group monoculture that is the cool season or the tall fescue clover mix, right? So that is not a monoculture in so much as it's two different species. But it's from a functional group, they're both cool seasons, and so you're breaking a functional group monoculture by doing that. So, yes, sir.
So you were saying planting them into fescue sod, so basically you go out there and raise them fescue in the spring. How low do you raise them?
Again, this is probably a question better answered by a forage agronomist, but we did like 5 to 6 inches in 2024 at the Southwest Center of Mount Vernon and tried to plant sun hemp in it. And we got a lot of sun hemp plants that got about that tall, but then they got shaded out in the canopy by the fescue that was still there. And so, I think it's going to have to be a fairly aggressive.
What time did you plant that?
We planted that in, I'm trying to remember the specific date. It was in early May. I want to say it was sometime around the 3rd of May. But that's going to be different, right? Because that's extreme Southwest Missouri versus up here. So,
So you planted 3rd of May and then raised it?
No, we grazed the pastures. We didn't graze them. We actually brush hogged these pastures, but we didn't get our brush hog down low enough. It was part of a research project that we were doing, so we didn't even run the cattle through there. What we did was we preferred grazing. We brush hogged them and we planted them, but we didn't brush hog it tight enough. I think you can plant the sun hemp later than what we did, but we were trying to maximize our forage availability because our original plan was to turn cattle out on the sun hemp. So that study that I showed you, we were going to take a portion of the cattle that we were keeping past the 84 days, and we were going to allocate them to sun hemp pastures in an effort to try and improve the average daily gains. And so those cattle would have gone on to that sun hemp pasture about the 20th of June, but we just didn't get enough forage to actually. We didn't get enough sun hemp, so it makes it happen.
2 months by the time.
Yeah, we were shooting for a good 6 weeks. A good 6 weeks was our plan, but it didn't work out that way. So.
What's the maximum corn size you can put in your cow's diet?
What is the maximum corn silage you could put into a beef cow's diet? That's a great question. So I generally, for a very generic ration, I like a ration that's 9 parts corn silage and 1 part dried distillers grains, because corn silage on its own does not have enough crude protein to maximize ruminal fermentation, especially if a cow is lactating. That's a very generic recommendation, and it's assuming that the silage moisture is approximately the silage dry matter is approximately 35% or 65% moisture. So that will vary depending on specific your analysis of the silage. I don't think the silage needs a silage ration fed cow needs dry hay per se. The only reason that anybody might put silage or hay into a silage ration is simply to stretch the forage, the feed resources out longer and to dilute the energy content of the diet. So if I was feeding lactating fall calving cows, I would probably go more aggressive. If I was going to feed and just not put any hay in the diet, if I was going to feed spring calving cows that were in that second or third trimester gestation, they're probably going to gain weight and get fleshy on something like that if you fed that for an extended period of time. So it's a good question. I'm glad you asked that. Yes, sir.
We did a bunch of gamma grass again last year through the RCS program. What would be a good legume to put with perennial native grasses?
Why do you need a lagoon to be one? I'm going to answer a question with a question like a jerk.
Well, the place that we got it, it's not anywhere where you can graze because it's a long ways away. So, and my dad did a bunch of gamma grass in the 1990s. It's still eventually there, but it's rough. And like your gamma grasses and your bunch of grasses, there's a lot of space in between. They're filled up with something else. What would you put with something kind of fill in those gaps?
Well, I think it depends on the productivity of your gamma grass, right? If you're getting 3 tons per acre off of gamma grass already, I mean, if you add some sort of a lagoon component to that, it might add a ton. And for me, what's the cost benefit ratio? I think, are you trying to maximize tonnage? Are you trying to improve forage quality?
That's the forage quality drops pretty precipitously.
Well, that to me, I always will answer questions like this with hay earlier, right? So, I think the fundamental mistake a lot of folks make with haying operations is that they try to maximize yield and not quality. And when you
stick with
I'd stick with a monoculture gamma grass so that I reduce my annual inputs into the field. I would try to harvest it earlier if I could, reasonably, right? So, the biggest gripe that farmers will have with harvesting fescue when it's in a vegetative state is that we don't have enough time in May between rainfall events to actually have it swathed, raked, and baled, right? And so then we wait till later on, or in a different approach, we just bale hay after we get done with all our other spring chores, planting, etc. And so then we stretch the hay making season out into July when it is drier, but it's also gone rank. The thing about the farm season grasses is that even if you back up the hay in a little bit, you're probably backing up into a period of time where it's good still hay, not because of weather, rainfall, or things like that. So that's my 2 cents. You'll get different opinions from different folks, but
grace intentions and then the rain.
oh, absolutely, right? Yeah, I mean, what do we have in Columbia this year? 9 inches of precip in July, right? So we respect that perspective,
I read an interesting study though. It said that the degradation of hay being rained on was less than the degradation of waiting an extra week and letting it get a week more mature to harvest. Thus, that we put a lot of time and effort into worrying about this not getting it wet. But are we really having as much negative impact as we're thinking about as far as hay being made? And it depends upon when you mowed it compared to when it got moisture on it and how much it was, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that data set myself, so I think that's a relevant question. But again, if grazing's not the answer, y'all are asking the wrong questions. Like I'll die on that hill. So.
Let's thank Dr.
All right.
Riley. I think lunch is next on